it's time for our message for today. We are continuing on in our message series in the book of Song of Songs. Depending on your Bible, if you brought yours here today, it might be called the Song of Solomon or Solomon's Song of Songs. This is one of the only books in the Bible where, oddly, everybody seems to have a slightly different name for it. But in our pew Bibles that you'll see in the seats in front of you, it's referred to as Song of Songs. And if you don't have a Bible with you today, or you just prefer to use ours, feel free to grab that, and you can open up to page 673, and you'll find the passage that we're reading. We're going to be in Song of Songs, chapter 3. While you're turning there, I just want to share briefly some stories from the Pounds household this week. We have actually, I'm glad people are excited. So we've actually had a head cold moving through our house this week, and we thought we were done with it midweek, and then actually yesterday we had to take Hazel into the doctor's office because she has a bad ear infection. Apparently, this is kind of gross. Apparently, you can actually see pus in there, which isn't a good sign. So she's on antibiotics now, and Annabelle and all the kids are home today trying to mend. But in the midst of all of that, for one of Hazel's good days, we had the preschool Valentine's Day party. And so I got to go in there and sit with her in preschool, and all the little kids gave away their Valentines to each other. And when we got home, Hazel had 3 of them left. And our 3 oldest kids were excited about that. And so Annabelle decided, rather than us storing these somewhere and trying to use them next year, let's just let each of the kids open one more Valentine. And so Marlo, our 3-year-old, was the first one to open his Valentine, and he opened it up and pulled it out, and a giant pink unicorn was on his. Now, for most boys, they wouldn't be terribly excited about this. And to be frank, I don't think that Marlo even knows what a unicorn is. However, Hazel, our 4-year-old, was like, a unicorn, I want that! And she reached out for it, and so Marlo ripped it away, and now it was the most precious thing on earth. He was going to keep that. He would fight to the death for it. And so Hazel, a moment later, our 4-year-old, she opens up her card, and she pulls out a pink pony, and I think she's like, well, I mean, it's not a unicorn, but it'll do, I guess. In a pinch, we could live with this. And Hudson, our 2-year-old, he rounds it out, and Hudson opens up his card. His face lights up huge. He rips it out of the envelope, and he holds it up as if he is seeking power from God imbued through it, and says, it's a unicorn! It was a llama. But, to a 2-year-old, unicorn and a llama, they're basically the same thing. I'm not really worried about it. We didn't want to burst his bubble. So he was happy with his llama, and I guess everybody was happy overall. But it's interesting when you have kids how these things work themselves out. So, as a reminder to you guys, we are in the book of Song of Songs. And Song of Songs is a poetic book, but it's a poetic book which is actually written, and it's sort of strange in its format, but there's a reason for it. It seems as if it's a script, but without the underlying plot put there. And so we have to make some jumps to understand the plot points of what are going on. And by studying the book, we can come to some conclusions with that. I'll share with you mine as we go through, but of course, you're welcome to come to your own as well. Now, what we've seen unfold so far in the book, we're in the 3rd chapter, and we've read, over the last 2 weeks, we've read the first 2 chapters. In chapter 1, we saw this young couple, and from context, because in the ancient Near East, you wouldn't go on a date with somebody typically unless there was an arranged marriage and you were already planning to move in that direction. We see this young couple who begins to develop strong feelings for each other. She talks about how great his character is, how he's known in the community and desired by many of the young women in the community because he's such a person of integrity, even at this young age, that he's so capable and has such good virtue. And she is already coming into this feeling really strongly for him, and him for his part. He is wild about how gorgeous she is and how good a girl she seems to be. And so these 2 young people begin falling for each other in chapter 1. And we talked about the importance of looking for character in a spouse when we're going through that. And even the importance of looking for good character in friends when we do that as well. And as we moved on to chapter 2, we began to see the romance seem to continue to grow up until a point. And for reasons we don't know, we had him come to her house, and sometimes we'll refer to them as he and she. They're never named. Other times we might refer to them as the shepherd or the shepherdess, because the book describes both of them as being shepherds. But he comes to her house, and he invites her one day out on a date, and basically says, this is beautiful spring weather, flowers are blooming everywhere, everything is green, you and I should go out for a walk. We should just go take in the beauty of everything that God made. And we don't know why, but for some reason, some hurt or habit or hang-up in her life leads her to a point where she says no. And she says no to this guy, and this is important context for today's passage. And after she does, he begins to walk away, and he gives this warning in our relationships about being careful about allowing foxes into our vineyard. In other words, we need to avoid letting destructive things into our relationship. And we talked about how in our relationships today, there's a lot of destructive things that we might allow into it, and we've got to be really careful to protect ourselves from that. Because whether you've been married for 60 years or 6, or whether you just started dating, there are some really destructive forces out there in the world. And whether it be the media sources that you're ingesting, or the ideas that you're taking in, or the boundaries you're putting in place, whatever it is, you can destroy a relationship pretty quick if you don't handle these things right. So as the book concluded, the man was walking away, he was leaving, and she just seemed to be smacking herself on the head, saying, "What did I just do? I'm in love with that guy. That's the guy I want to be with." And he came to me and he asked me out on a nice date and said, "Let's go, it's beautiful, it's spring, we can have a nice time together, get to know each other more." And I said, "No." And we see at the close of chapter 2, she even says, "I was just waited there at the door of my house, waiting, hoping he would turn around and come back and say, 'Are you sure? Are you sure? Maybe. I mean, I don't want to push too hard.'" But he took her no to mean no. He walked away. And here she is, wondering if she's destroyed this relationship, if things are now going to unravel. She's weighing out all of this. Because again, they've had these strong feelings for each other, but some destructive force has been allowed into this relationship, and it's pushed her to a point where she didn't invest in it when it was probably the right time. And just to show some sympathizing here, really, think about where he's at. You know, he must have thought, "Man, I thought I was going to marry this girl. I thought we were getting along as well as we possibly could. Did I have my hair combed wrong or something? What happened? How did I scare her away like this? I thought it was good, but she doesn't want to do anything to do with me." So that is how the last chapter led off. That's going to be the context for chapter 3 as we begin that. As we usually do, guys, we're going to read our chapter in 3 different sections. Each time we'll read a section, we'll stop, we'll break it down verse by verse, and we'll discuss it. And I hope that God will use that to bring it to life for you. Because in this book, we're going to see a lot of what the Lord has to say about relationships, about marriage, and even about sex. We'll get there in the next few weeks. Don't turn ahead too quick, guys, okay? Just wait. We'll get there. But there's a lot of good insight here. And it's good for us as a church and as a people to just have some frank conversations about these things as we go. So I hope you'll tolerate my candor as we walk through all this. We're going to begin today by reading verses 1 through 2. But before we do that, I want to just ask you guys to join me for a moment. Let's just ask God into this situation and ask Him to open our hearts to what we're about to read. Heavenly Father, we are a people and we live in a culture where it's much easier to see the mistakes and brokenness of the person next to us than it is in ourselves. But today, Lord, we need the clarity to do the latter. I pray that you would open our hearts to your word. They aren't here by accident. Help us to see what you're trying to communicate to us. Help us to live life in a way more pleasing to you so that we can come to know you more, so that we can experience more of the abundance you have for us. Lord, I pray you'd push aside whatever distractions were here this week and in these moments. We would enter your presence and we would see you more clearly and see ourselves through you. We pray this in Jesus Christ's name and merit, Father. Amen. Okay. Song of Songs, chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. This is her speaking. All night long on my bed, I looked for the one my heart loved. I looked for him, but did not find him. I will get up now and go about the city, through its streets and squares. I will search for the one my heart loves. So I looked for him, but I did not find him. Okay, so on the tail end of experiencing this regret, this remorse for this guy that she has this feelings for, and being asked out and telling him to just leave and not now. Now she's waiting up late at night, and it's burdening her heart. She must be having 1,000 things go through her mind. Did I ruin this relationship? Is he out with some other girl right now? How has this relationship changed? What's it? Is it over? Is it Is it going to be able to be healed? What's going to happen? And as people are sometimes prone to do, probably many of you at some point in time have felt some conflicting emotions surrounding romance and been kept up and not slept as well as you would like to. And so in this case, she is having the same experience. She is laying here on her bed, really unsure about what to do, unsure about what the future holds, and really being burdened by it. Now, let me mention as we read this, there's two basic ways that scholars understand what's going to happen in this chapter as a whole. Some say that part or all of this is a dream that's actually happening as she's laying there on her bed. And others suggest that it's a literal series of events that happen and she's awake. I'm going to suggest to you that it's the latter, because as we read through this, we're going to see that where this ends up is the most logical point, I think, for us to go to with this. But you all have the liberty to believe what you wish to with this. It's not a salvational issue. Either way, there's some deep things to learn here. But I'm going to recommend to you that we look at this as she's awake and she's going to go do these things. So while she's laying awake on her bed, as she described herself, she's thinking about this guy, and as it goes along, the burden for this grows and grows and grows, and finally she can't take it anymore. In the wee hours of the morning, it's still dark out, we imagine, she gets up and she decides, I'm just going to go out. I'm going to go out into town, I'm going to go walk around, and I'm going to hope that somewhere out there in the city, I can find him. That he'll be around here, and I can find him, and I can say I'm sorry, and I can try to fix this thing because I might have ruined the relationship. Now let me ask you something. If we took one random guy and one random girl and had them walk up and down streets in Myrtle Point all night, what are odds that they'd actually run into each other? They might not be great. Even if both people were out there looking for each other, the odds are not super. I mean, there's a chance. It's better than it would be in, say, Seattle. But still, this is a strange thing. And beyond that, for a young woman to go out alone at night and wander the streets would have been against a cultural norm. There isn't a normal sort of police force that exists in this time. There will be some people keeping watch, as we'll see in a moment, but they're mostly watching outside to make sure there aren't raiders or invaders or something like that sneaking up and coming in. They're supposed to alert people, and while they might step into a bad situation if they saw it, there isn't a lot of crimes that are to be caught, and the young woman alone at night is in a pretty vulnerable place. Nonetheless, she goes out and she's walking up and down the streets in desperation, praying, hoping, maybe I can find him. Maybe somewhere out here he'll be. There's a chance he's at home asleep. She really doesn't know. So let's see. We're going to find out as we continue onward what will happen. So now we'll read verses 3 through 5. It's going to be a pretty brief passage today to warn you in advance. All right. The watchmen found me as they made their rounds in the city. Have you seen the one my heart loves? Scarcely had I passed them when I found the one my heart loves. I held him and would not let him go till I had brought him to my mother's house, to the room of the one who conceived me. Daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you by the gazelles and by the does of the field. Do not arouse or awaken love until it so desires. Okay, so she has been out there for who knows how long. She's been looking, hoping she can find this young man who she's fallen in love with. And one has to imagine that the fear of this relationship being lost, that is probably weighing on her, and it's probably one of the things that's helped her to realize just how much she cares about the relationship, right? You guys have been in a relationship and felt that sense of, oh man, this might end? Then you might relate to. That makes you, in some sense, have to really make some assessments about what the relationship means to begin with. And for this young woman, this process, no doubt, has done that. She's going around, and as she's walking around, she finds the watchmen, and the watchmen, as I said, are people responsible for watching for largely external threats to the village that they live in, making sure that there's no raiders that are going to come in and attack them or something like that. She runs into them, and she figures they've been walking around all night. That's their job. Maybe they'll know, maybe they'll have seen him, and so she asks, do you guys know where he's at? Have you seen the person that I love? Have you seen the guy I have these feelings for? And it seems they tell her, nope. Sorry, haven't seen him at all. Probably feeling more hopeless than ever, she continues forward, and in that moment, she looks out, and she sees him. She sees the guy that she's in love with. He is walking through the streets too. It does prompt the question, why? And maybe to suggest something, I imagine that the inverse of the questions she's weighing out are what he's weighing out. That is to say, she's up wondering why she said no, and he's probably up wondering why she said no. the same problem. I can't believe she'd do that. What did I do wrong? I can't believe it. I thought I was going to marry her. And yet I did something to ruin this relationship, and I don't even know what. So I can't fix it. And so when she sees him, we hear that she runs up, she hugs him, wraps her arms around him, and basically won't let him go until she goes home with him, until she goes home to meet with her mom. And so she has made a firm decision in her mind. I screwed up. I should have moved forward with this, and I didn't. I was worried I was going to lose the relationship over it. Now she goes ahead and takes him with her, brings her to her mother's room in the house that she lives in, and they meet together. Now, there's a lot of reasons why. You might ask, why go meet with the mom? Why go do that? And it's a good question. Some philosophers or theologians point out, well, you know, your mom's room or the place where your mom is at tends to be a safe place. You might feel some sense of safety. That might depend on what your relationship with your mother was like and what her character was like. But on the averages, a lot of people find a sense of calm and peace with their mother. But another thing that I want to point out with this, and we'll see why this is relevant in a moment, is we've seen in the context of this passage so far that in the previous verses, this young woman's brothers were the ones who seemed to be running the land that she lived on. They were the ones who were operating it, which is strange because typically that would be the father's role. Typically the father would be managing all the agricultural land. And it would lead one to believe that perhaps her father has already passed away. In fact, maybe her father's passing and the emotions surrounding that are part of the hang-up that held her back from going out on that date the day before. Maybe she's still processing all that. Again, not all the details are given, but this is a good possibility as we look through it. Now, if that's the case, then the mother would be a key person who you would want to have a conversation with if you decided that you wanted to move your relationship from a dating or from an engaged relationship, which in a sense is like a committed dating relationship in the ancient world, up to a marriage. And in a moment we're going to see some evidence that that in fact is what they're doing. She brings him home and she's made this decision. I'm done with these games. You and I just need to get married. Let's make that move. And apparently he feels the same way. I don't want to deal with this question about whether you're mine and I'm yours anymore. I just want the commitment. I want us to be decided and to go there. And so they make that, they begin working towards that decision. Now I'll mention with this, as we talk about logistically a wedding in the ancient world, interesting to note, ancient weddings actually had festivals that surrounded them, or festivities that surrounded them, that lasted about a week's time. So it wasn't just a 2-hour thing. There wasn't that small commitment. On the plus side, there was lots of good food and beverages and a luxurious setup typically done with it. Also good to note, in the ancient world, most people didn't have calendars on their wall that they could thumb through. So if you said, well, in October 16th, we're going to get married, not many people would know when that was, if the date was what the date is now. That'd just be a long, long time from now. And hopefully we'll remember when it gets here. So most of the time when people were doing these things, they'd be pretty quick to get about it. Normally it would be more like, okay, in 11 days, we're going to get together. On the Saturday, we're going to get together, and that's when the wedding is going to start. So you guys can come and join us that day, and that's when things will begin. And then people would be able to plan this all out, and they would know what their time was like. And if they were good friends or family, or just really enjoyed a big buffet, in effect, then they'd probably show up and enjoy the festivities and be a part of it and wish you well along the journey. And a good aspect of this is that the whole community would see really quickly. Those two are married. Those two are together. They can all see it put out in public and know that that connection had happened, that those families were united in a sense. And so as we look at the wedding, good to know it's not the traditional Western wedding, but something much more elaborate. And that's how it happens. Now, let's go ahead and we'll continue on with verses 6 through 11. And let me warn you as we go into this. We're going to hear a lot about King Solomon in here. And as we've talked about in the past, there are two ways that this can be understood. Some scholars say we're literally talking about King Solomon. Some say this is actually metaphoric. And I'm going to suggest to you that the latter is the case. But let's read through it, and we'll talk about the merits of that a little bit more, and then we'll break it down. So starting at verse 6 and finishing out the book, or the chapter. Who is this coming up from the wilderness like a column of smoke, perfumed with myrrh and incense, made with all the spices of the merchant? Look, it's Solomon's carriage, escorted by 60 warriors, the noblest of Israel, all of them wearing the sword of all experienced in battle, each with his sword at his side, prepared for the terrors of the night. King Solomon made for himself the carriage. He made it of wood from Lebanon. Its posts he made of silver, its base of gold. Its seat was upholstered in purple, its interior inlaid with love. Daughters of Jerusalem, come out and look. You daughters of Zion, look on the King Solomon wearing a crown. The crown with which his mother had crowned him on the day of his wedding, the day his heart rejoiced. Okay, as I said, there's those two theories for this. Again, I'm going to suggest to you this is metaphoric for a few reasons. First of all, in the ancient world, it was very common to use language of kings and queens to describe people in a relationship, couples in a relationship. It was a way of idealizing. Second of all, when we read earlier in this passage, we heard that this shepherd and shepherdess had been established in this community for a long time, that his character was very well known. So people already knew who he was. And the people who hold the theory that this is in fact King Solomon literally would suggest that King Solomon basically was duping her this whole time, that he was pretending to be a shepherd, but in fact, he was the king. And so in this day, at this moment, this is where she realizes it's actually the king that I've been dating. The challenge with that is, if the character of each of them was part of the reason that the relationship was successful to begin with, it's weird for somebody to have an established reputation and family and character and a community and have it all be an alias. That's a pretty good cover, right, if you're going to do that. Now that said, whatever a person chooses to believe with this, the main point behind it is the same. Whether this in fact is King Solomon, whether it is in fact the shepherd, and she's seeing him in these idealized ways, then regardless, the point becomes the same as we look at this. So at these wedding feasts, to give us some more context, walking into what we just read, at these wedding feasts, typically the bride's family would be responsible for most of the setup. They would incur a lot of the cost for that. They would put together the feast. And as the groom was preparing to come, he would gather together his trusted friends, perhaps men that worked for him or under him, or even people who fought with him if he was a warrior in nature. He'd bring them all together, and then they would come at the outset of the feast and make a dramatic entry into it. That would be their entrance coming there. And that seems to be the event that she's describing, regardless of who it is. She sees her lover, the person she's in love with, coming through, and she sees him, and she thinks, man, this guy is like a king. He is so awesome. He's got this beautiful group of people around him. People respect him. They follow him. He has the capacity to use force to defend himself and others. We're talking about the sword. In the ancient world, that was a big thing, by the way. When a woman went to search for a mate, it was important that they have the capacity to provide some level of protection, because there typically wasn't a police force that was out and around to do that. There was no 911 you could dial. So if some random person decided they wanted to break into your house, you better solve the problem. You better be ready for it. And in this case, she's appreciating all these aspects of him. He's strong, he's capable, he has a lot of capable people around him, and here he is dramatically as if he were a king coming in. And in some ways, the hyperbole of this is interesting because while David and Solomon had 30 mighty men, here as the king comes up, he's got 60 mighty men. He's got twice as many as those other guys. And so they're coming dramatically, and the fanciest spices and the fanciest building materials and all of the fanciest best stuff is what she sees him characterized. And in many ways, especially as a young woman, we probably can see a place where there could be some of this idealizing, right? Where in young love, they could look and think, oh my gosh, this person is so wonderful. Look at the person who's coming. Now, good to know too, of course, this is all written from the bride's perspective. As we're reading this is her speaking. And this book actually will have the majority of its dialogue coming from the female's perspective, unlike some other books like Proverbs, where largely it's actually coming from the male perspective. So it's interesting as we watch through this, we can kind of see it through her eyes. But as he comes up, she's utterly in love with him, and she talks in the final verses about how the crown that's on his head was placed on his head by his mother for the day of his wedding, which would imply to us that this is in fact the day of his wedding. With some of the stuff that happens afterwards, I think we're going to figure out that they just got married. Because as you guys might recall or might have heard, oftentimes when people abstain and then get married, other things happen afterwards. Does that sound familiar? And we're going to talk about some of that, as I said, in the next few weeks. And we're going to see some poetic imagery about that. Again, guys, don't turn the pages yet. But we'll get there. But we see this celebration, these two people who at the beginning of our chapter were really starting to wonder whether this relationship was even Solomon, whether it could even really move forward. Now they're together. They're married. They began that union, and they began their lives together. And that begins a new aspect of the relationship. In terms of how we apply this, though, I really want to draw your attention back to verse 5, which we didn't discuss a lot before, just prior to the wedding. This is the second time that we have heard her say this. And we're going to hear it 2 more times, actually, as we go through the book. This is a verse that, if it repeats 4 times, anytime something keeps happening again and again in the Bible, keeps getting said again and again, we should probably take that as a sign, right? It's important enough that God was worried we didn't hear it the first time, so he might need to say it a few more. Okay, so verse 5, daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you by the gazelles and by the does of the field. Do not arouse or awaken love until it so desires. Let me ask you guys something. Have you ever met somebody, and when you first met him, you thought, that's a great person. I like that guy. And initially, you thought, wow, that's a good person. And yet, a week or 2 later, maybe even a month later, in interacting with them, you started to think, I'm not sure my assessment was right. I might have been a little or even a lot off about all that. Any of you ever had that experience? Yeah, right? Common to the human experience. And it would be nice to think. I wish I could think this of myself, that I could just look at anyone and know, oh, I know where that guy's at. I can see it. I can tell. But sometimes we get duped, don't we? Is it possible to fall in love with somebody before you've asked some sensible questions about it? Absolutely. In fact, most of us can probably name some folks. Maybe even point to ourselves. Whatever the case might be. But there is this aspect of human experience. And here, we're getting a really vivid warning from her that we've got to be cautious. Because this emotion of love, and even in the previous chapter when this was used, it was in reference to physical intimacy, to sexual desire. She was talking about him putting his left hand under her arm and embracing her with his right. She was dreaming about making out with this guy the first day they met. It was already moving there. We can get things way ahead of where they should be if we're not careful. And we can see a clear warning of that. Now, there's a few ways that we can understand this warning, and I think it's a few contexts, really. If you're a single person, young or old, wherever you find yourself, if you're a single person and you're dating, or you're considering dating, or you might consider dating sometime in the future, then exactly what's happening here is the situation I think we're being warned about. And the strange part is our culture tells us all the time that we should do the exact opposite of this. I mean, you watch Disney movies over the last 20 years. How many seconds does it take for someone to figure out they've met their soulmate? Like 2.5, right? Just like, oh, bam, that's her. Okay, problem solved. And it always has a happy ending. If people actually chose their spouses that way, would that work out well? No. I mean, probably most of you, like me, can think of times where you thought, oh, wow, that seems like a great girl to marry. And then you found out, oh boy, maybe I was wrong. For you girls, probably about a guy, too. And certainly we have those same flaws. So we've all missed some stuff. And we have a generation that actually often thinks that things are going to happen like they do in a Disney movie. And the truth of the matter is, we need to be a lot more prudent than that. We've got to guard our hearts. You know, when I was 16, I became a Christian. And pretty shortly after becoming a Christian, one of the things that God really revealed to me is that I was kind of stupid. And that I really wasn't ready to start dating. And God convicted me that I didn't have my relationship with him figured out. And so I really had no business going out and looking for a lifelong relationship with somebody else. I had that desire, but at 16 years old, going from a really dark background to suddenly having everything in my life turning around and turning upside down in some senses, because I decided I was going to follow Jesus whatever he said. Things were a lot different. It took some time to figure out me and God before I was ready. But when I became 21, I started dating, and I remember, at first I wondered if I could even get a date with somebody. I waited long enough, and so I'd go out. And it's strange, because to be frank with you guys, I had a lot of first dates. And that was for a reason. Sometimes it's because they saw me and they were like, nope. And fortunately my wife didn't have that impulse. But other times it was because I used that first date as, you know, especially teenagers here, listen to me on this. You'll save yourself a lot of pain. I used that first date as an opportunity, in a sense, to do a job interview. The reality is there's going to be a whole lot of people in this world that you can be attracted to. That's not a big problem. But are there a whole lot of people who you want to actually spend the rest of your life with? It's a big question. It's one that's worth answering. So why don't you think about some questions that might be important in that process for you to sort that out. And before you go and fall deeply in love with them, or before you let your physical desires for them take over where the relationship is going, actually ask some questions. Here's some questions. If you're here and you're a Christian, the Bible is pretty clear that you really should look to marry someone who's at a similar place in their spiritual life. And we know statistically, regardless of religion actually, statistically, just looking at it objectively, people who have a common faith and who have a common level of commitment to that faith have higher marital success rates. They have happier marriages, they have longer lasting marriages. It's a good thing to look for. So it might be a good thing for you to ask that other person, hey, where are you at with Jesus? Is he important to you at all? Maybe they have some inclinations towards it, but they're not really living it out. That's a great thing to find out, and often the person will tell you that openly on the first date. That could be helpful. If they say, I have no interest in Christianity, then don't be mean to them. Don't tell them they're a horrible person, but you can say, it's been cool to hang out with you, appreciated it. Have a nice day. And that could be the end of it. You could end it then. And there's no reason to give your heart to somebody who wants nothing to do with Jesus if your life is surrounded by looking towards Jesus. But there's bigger issues than that even. You know, there are differences in lifestyle. What are their expectations for what level of lifestyle that they might live out? Are they wanting to go be a missionary in a foreign country and you have no desire to do that? Well, maybe you should pray about that. But if you're firmly resolved, I would never set foot, for example, in Africa, well, then you probably shouldn't marry someone who wants to be a missionary there, right? That seems like a bad decision. Your life trajectories are going in different directions. Now, beyond all of that, frankly, we talked about character the first week, but when you're dating, when you're on a date with somebody, you really should be looking for signs. Looking for any indicators of what their character is like. If they say that what they love to do is to go out and party every day, if they seem to lack the dedication to even hold a job, or whatever the case might be. There's lots of these signs, right? That somebody might not be as good a spouse. But look for that. And again, the point isn't that you condemn that person or tell them they're horrible. It might even be that they're a really good person. You're just headed in different directions. You'd be wiser to know that right to begin with. If you knew that to begin with, then you could decide whether it was worth risking your heart getting broken or engaging in that. And honestly, if a bunch of these things don't line up, then you're being, we'll say it kindly, you're being silly to continue forward with things the way they are. You're really just looking for trouble. Whether they're really pretty or not, whether you have really good chemistry or not, that's not the point. If your lives are headed different directions and you bind them together, there's going to be a whole lot of tug of war going on. So that's one boundary. The other boundary I want to point out with people who are dating, and I know that they actually say that at this point 70% of Americans under the age of 44 will have lived with somebody before they get married. We talk about cohabitation briefly. Another thing to watch out for, guys, is putting good physical boundaries in place. If you find somebody and they pass that first test and you like them and you think I might want to build a relationship with them, you've got to be so cautious about introducing sex into that relationship and having that right off the bat. It's not that the sex won't be pleasurable, it's that it might lead you to overlook a whole lot of broken aspects about who that person is and feel obligated to go forward with it anyway. And you really need to be objective about your decision making in this. And part of how you do that, if you're a Christian or if you're not a Christian, either way, part of how you do that is having some wise boundaries in place about how you live your life, how you're going to do that dating, right? You can decide to never be alone with that person. I have not seen, hopefully I never will, in my life, a young dating couple who decided to enter the thralls of matrimony on the floor of the supermarket, for example. Right? Not a common sight, because most of us at least have the tact to not break those rules. If we're around in the public, we're probably not going to become physically intimate. So if you plan your dates in public places, you're going to have a lot easier time not falling into these temptations. But if you decide that you and your girlfriend are going to hang out in your bedroom all the time, where's that going to lead you? And I know some of you guys, look, I wrestled with this too. And to be frank, when I was dating Annabelle, we didn't have sex before we were married, but we crossed some boundaries that we wish we wouldn't have. And it happened because we were dumb enough to think that we were above it all. It won't affect us. We're two devout people. We're going to Bible college. Come on now. It doesn't matter. If you're biologically in these sexes and you have this attraction, those impulses are going to pull you together. So be cautious about that. It has a gravity to it. And you need to be strategic about all this. So often, these mistakes, they sound like simple mistakes, I know a bunch of pastors like to talk about him, and maybe you think we're being pharisaical talking about it. But it's not because I want to wag my finger and throw rules at you. It's because I want you to have the most blessed relationships you possibly can. And so, again, especially for our teens who are here, I want to emphasize to you guys, I know I'm just the silly old guy talking about this stuff. You will save yourself a lot of pain if you listen to me on this. And there are plenty of people who have broken these rules, who have walked down that road, and they can tell you the stories of how that worked out. So you don't have to look far to find that. Now, let's talk for married people. All right, so we talked about folks who are single and how to set up these safeguards to not fall into love before the right time. For married people, one of the big things that wrecks marriages in this country is that we're not setting the appropriate relationships with people of the other sex. We think that we can go out and have lunch with, for example, in my case, that I can just go out and have lunch with a pretty young girl. And it won't be a big problem at all. We'll go have lunch alone, we'll just go sit around and talk to each other alone. When you spend time together, you start to build a relationship, whether you intend to or not. And there's a real danger to that. In fact, one of the leading factors for whether or not somebody will actually enter a dating relationship or get married is the amount of time that they spend around each other. Something as simple as that's why most people find their spouse as co-workers. That's the most common place to find your spouse, at work. And the reason is pretty straightforward. You're locked up with them for lots of hours each day. So you get to know each other, you get to see each other pretty clearly, you feel like you have a pretty good assessment of, all right, I don't think that person's crazy, or oh, they've got some great qualities that I actually appreciate. You'll have a chance to see that. On the flip side of that, though, if you don't have good boundaries and you don't actually protect your marriage by keeping some necessary distance, then you could find yourself romantically entangled with someone who's not your spouse. And that's a real danger. And I know some people have fallen into this. Again, I'm not trying to finger wag. I'm trying to warn, because your marriage is one of the biggest blessings God's given you. By the way, if you're wondering if you're married to the right person, you're married to him, then yes is the answer. Okay? Good enough. All right? God's there. You need to try to honor him in that. All right? Don't be looking for your way out. But if you're going to be married, then you need to give yourself fully to that other person. And for men and women both, there just seems to be this thought that, well, this guy can be my best friend and he can be my husband and it's going to be okay. And I don't know how many times this adds up to complications. Look, I'm not saying when the pretty girl at your workplace comes up to you on Monday and says good morning to you, that you say, get out of here, I don't want to talk to you. That would make sure that nothing happened, I guess. But you can still be friendly. But I have noticed, especially with recently married men, that oftentimes we get in the habit of walking up to girls we don't know and being extra friendly, right? Yeah, I mean, it just sort of becomes a habit. You want to see if you can find dating prospects with people, and sometimes that sort of becomes muscle memory in a sense. You need to curb some of that, because that's not your job anymore. You found the person, and you need to protect that. In order to do that, you've got to have these boundaries. And this is not just applicable to married people interacting with single people. I've seen a lot of married people who thought, I can go hang out and spend lots of time with my buddy's spouse and nothing will happen. Again, proximity has a danger to it. You need to be cautious. Now, I'm not talking about you and somebody who's your grandmother's age, for example. All right? Sometimes those things will help cause enough divide that there can be like a mother-son type relationship, and you can have some more laxness there. But if there's somebody who you're sexually attracted to or sexually compatible with, please just draw the boundary. Be cautious. And don't fall into this. The warning that we're getting from this woman is happening in the thralls of the love that she has for this guy. She has started to realize as she wanders out in sort of a crazy sense in the middle of the night to go find this guy who within a short period of time she's fallen in love with. She's realizing that even though she does want to marry this guy, and even though she thinks it's wise to marry this guy, that love has a really big power to it. And whether it be the emotions of love or physical attraction, if you start sowing those seeds, it can grow into something, and you need to make sure you're ready to walk through that before you head that way. Now, if she can see it then, we need to see it now. And we need to have the wisdom to guard our relationships, or, for those who are single, walking into new relationships, to protect those as well. Someday you are going to meet your spouse, and you don't want to do it after your life has turned into a soap opera. Frankly, ideally, you want to do it in the best place that you can be with God so that you're ready for that person. So that you're actually ready to fully commit yourself to the relationship. And so the warning is really vivid here. And the sad part is, if I'm frank with you as a pastor, we like to ignore it, don't we? And maybe we like to ignore it because we think we're impervious to these things. Other people, they struggle with it, not me, right? Or maybe it's because deep down, if we were honest about it, we'd rather go do that than obey God. I mean, we put this up here like, yeah, of course I would obey God, unless. And that's a dangerous unless. And again, we won't go down those roads if we put the right boundaries in place. So at this time, I'm going to call Nate forward. He's going to lead us in our communion and offering meditations. I'll ask our deacons to come forward too. As they do, this week, you guys, my challenge to you is to look for areas where your boundaries and your relationships aren't in place right now. Look at yourself, not at your neighbor, and ask yourself, is there anywhere I need to curb this? Is there anywhere I need to make some adjustments? Are these even things you've thought about before? Because there's a very destructive path that it leads to if we don't. And as your pastor, I don't want to see any of you go through it. That's my desire. This is not me finger wagging. This is me hoping that you guys live happy, healthy, successful lives. But if you want to do it, the best way to do it is to decide right now, whatever your past might be, to decide right now that what happens going forward is going to be in the middle of God's will. That is a good way to insulate yourself. Please join me for a moment of prayer. Lord, the drama that sometimes fills our lives, it might make for good daytime TV, but it doesn't make for a lot of hope or a lot of happiness. Father, I know we have people here today who have not even dated anyone, and that's just fine. And we've got others that have been through a whole lot. Wherever these folks find themselves today, myself included, Lord, wherever we find ourselves, I pray that you would come and place yourself in the middle of our lives. Help us to live our relationships, not in light simply of our desires or what our neighbor says is smart, but in light of your will. Father, we see you have a plan for marriage, you have a plan for dating. And we also know that you've built into us a desire to connect with somebody else, to have this sort of deep, fundamental relationship with them and with you. So, Father, I pray that you would foster that relationship today, that you would help us to zealously protect it, whether our spouse has been found yet or not. Help us to put up the right boundaries around it so that through our lives, Lord, you might be honored. Others might see without a doubt that your hand is at work. We thank you for this time together, Lord, and we pray these things in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.